Imagine walking through the frostbitten alleys of an ancient Russian monastery, one that has stood for over 5 centuries, weathering the collapse of empires and the turn of ages. Now picture this. A team of restoration workers cracks open a cellar, sealed since the 17th century. What they find inside doesn't just challenge traditional narratives, it rewrites them. Paintings of biblical figures unlike anything most people have seen before. Deeply melanated skin, African features, regal garments. Figures clearly identified as Moses, David, and yes, Jesus. But these aren't just artistic interpretations. These discoveries are part of a growing body of historical evidence suggesting a truth long buried. Many of the original biblical Israelites were black. Today, we journey into one of the most provocative and controversial historical revelations of the 21st century, one that connects the Russian Orthodox Church, ancient biblical texts, African iconography, and suppressed knowledge. This isn't just about religion or race. It's about historical truth and how it has been shaped, edited, and in some cases deliberately hidden from us. Now, before we go deeper, let's get one thing clear. This is not a conspiracy theory video. This is a historical exploration based on visual evidence, recorded observations, and academic patterns that are increasingly being acknowledged in serious scholarship. We're not here to sensationalize, but to inform, bringing to light discoveries that have been kept in the shadows for far too long. Our story begins in the frozen heart of northern Russia, in places like the Solovetsky Monastery in the White Sea and other ancient Orthodox strongholds where massive archives and cellars have been closed off for hundreds of years. Over the past 2 decades, and especially in the last few years, the Russian government, in cooperation with Orthodox historians, has slowly been opening these sealed sections, initially for preservation purposes. But what they've uncovered has been quietly rippling through historical circles. Murals, icons, and religious manuscripts that clearly depict biblical figures as dark-skinned people. Not just tan or olive, we're talking about skin tones that undeniably reflect African ancestry. Afro-textured hair, Nubian features, details that were never meant to be ambiguous. Some of these pieces date back to the 1400s and 1500s, created by monks who were considered the most educated and pious men of their time. This wasn't some fringe movement. This was central church doctrine. So the big question arises, why? Why would Orthodox Christian monks in Russia paint Jesus, the prophets, and the patriarchs as black men? To answer that, we need to dive into a broader context. The modern image of Jesus, a light-skinned man with flowing brown hair and soft blue eyes, is a relatively recent invention. It was heavily popularized during the Renaissance period, especially through the influence of European artists like Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo, whose works reflected their own cultural environment more than historical accuracy. But if you rewind time even further, back to the first 1,000 years after Christ, depictions of Jesus and biblical figures were much more ethnically diverse, and in many cases, unmistakably African. For example, the Coptic Christians in Egypt have long maintained icons of a black Madonna and Christ child. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, one of the oldest Christian institutions in the world, still uses iconography featuring dark-skinned biblical figures. And now, with these Russian discoveries, it becomes even harder to deny that early Christianity had a far more Afrocentric expression than most people have been taught. But what's especially significant about these Russian findings is where they were located, behind sealed walls and buried in forgotten cellars. These weren't just misplaced artworks, they were intentionally stored or hidden, most likely during a time when a new narrative was being forged across Europe. A narrative that aligned biblical characters with the emerging image of white European identity. One of the most intriguing cases comes from a monastery near Arkhangelsk, where a 16th century painting shows a crucifixion scene. But unlike the familiar images, here Jesus is unmistakably black, surrounded by Roman soldiers with pale skin and red hair. This visual contrast is not subtle. It's not artistic license. It's a bold theological and historical statement. And it forces us to ask, was this a common belief at the time? Were these monks simply preserving an older truth that was later whitewashed? In fact, Russia's connection to ancient Hebrew and early Christian traditions goes deeper than many realize. Long before modern borders and national identities, there were powerful trade and cultural connections between Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and North Africa. The Black Sea and Silk Road networks weren't just for goods. They also carried ideas, people, and religion. It's entirely plausible and increasingly provable that early Christian communities in Russia were influenced by or even descended from Black Hebrew populations that had migrated or been scattered across the ancient world. And this brings us to an even more profound point, the concept of the biblical Israelites themselves. Who were they ethnically and culturally? While many assume they resembled modern Jewish populations from Europe, ancient historical sources, including Roman, Greek, and Arab historians, describe the Israelites as a dark-skinned people. The Bible itself references skin color numerous times, from the black as the tents of Kedar verse in the Song of Solomon to the Lamentations of Jeremiah, where he describes the children of Zion as being blacker than coal. Now, couple that with the historical scattering of the Israelites through slavery, exile, and diaspora, and we begin to see a picture that aligns with many African and Afro-descendant communities around the world today, especially those who have long claimed ancestral ties to Israel. Groups like the Igbo of Nigeria, the Lemba of Southern Africa, the Beta Israel of Ethiopia, and even African Americans who trace their spiritual and historical roots to the Hebrew Bible. But if all this is true, why has it been so aggressively suppressed? The answer is both simple and uncomfortable: power. In medieval Europe, religious imagery wasn't just about faith, it was about control. The face of Jesus determined who was considered holy, worthy, divine. If Jesus and the prophets were black, what would that mean for European monarchies that used Christianity to justify conquest and colonization? What would it mean for the slave trade, which dehumanized Africans while claiming Christian values? Rewriting biblical history to whiten its heroes wasn't just accidental. It was essential to maintaining a social order that placed whiteness at the top. And so, slowly but surely, the ancient black depictions of biblical figures were removed, repainted, or buried. Until now. What's emerging from Russia today is not just art, it's evidence. And while much of it has yet to be widely published or studied in the West, whispers from within the Russian academic and Orthodox circles confirm what the visuals suggest: that the early Christian world was far more ethnically diverse than modern retellings would have us believe. In the next segment of our exploration, we'll look at specific images uncovered in the Russian archives and compare them with similar depictions from Ethiopia, Egypt, and the early Middle Ages in Europe. We'll also uncover testimonies from early travelers and church historians who described what they saw with their own eyes: black saints, black messiahs, and a biblical world very different from the one we've been taught. But for now, we must ask ourselves, if the foundations of our religious and historical beliefs have been filtered through centuries of bias, isn't it time we go back and look at the original brushstrokes? Because history isn't just written in books, it's painted on walls, hidden in cellars, and waiting, always, to be rediscovered. Let's now examine one of the most striking revelations from these Russian cellar discoveries, a 15th century icon of the prophet Elijah. This painting, recovered from a crumbling monastery in the Vologda region, shows Elijah with a wide nose, full lips, tightly curled hair, and rich, dark brown skin. Not only is this depiction consistent with Semitic and African features, but it stands in stark contrast to the sanitized, Europeanized versions that would come to dominate Western religious art centuries later. What makes this even more fascinating is the historical context in which this icon was created. During the 1400s and 1500s, Russia was undergoing a religious and cultural transformation. The Orthodox Church was consolidating its doctrine, and monks in remote regions were meticulously copying and preserving older Byzantine and Eastern Christian works. Many of these monks had access to manuscripts and traditions that predated the Renaissance reinterpretations that would flood Western Europe. In other words, these weren't naive country priests painting what they imagined. These were highly educated scribes and theologians documenting what they believed to be historical truth. And they weren't alone. Similar depictions have been found across Eastern Europe, especially in areas influenced by the early Byzantine Empire. In Romania, Bulgaria, Georgia, and parts of Armenia, you'll find frescoes and icons of saints and prophets with unmistakable African features. In fact, some of these churches even feature Jesus himself as a dark-skinned man, sometimes called the Black Christ. A tradition that stretches back through the Coptic Church of Egypt and even into southern Italy, where the Black Madonna remains venerated to this day. What's more, these weren't fringe beliefs. Entire communities worshipped in front of these icons. They didn't just see Jesus or Elijah or Moses as black, they saw that blackness as divine, holy, chosen. Now imagine the seismic shift that occurred when Europe entered the age of exploration and colonization. Suddenly it became politically and economically important to frame whiteness as the symbol of purity, divinity, and leadership. Biblical imagery was retooled. Jesus became European, as did all the saints and prophets. The black icons were either destroyed or hidden, some buried beneath layers of white paint, and those that survived, forgotten in the dust of neglected monasteries or sealed behind walls during periods of political upheaval. That's why the recent Russian discoveries are so important. They aren't just accidental finds, they're cracks in the armor of a carefully constructed historical illusion. And they're not limited to paintings. Among the artifacts pulled from these cellars are illuminated manuscripts written in Old Church Slavonic, early translations of biblical texts complete with illustrations. One manuscript features a genealogy of the tribes of Israel with figures depicted in distinctly African phenotypes. This isn't modern revisionism. This is centuries-old theology captured in ink and pigment. But don't just take Russia's word for it. Let's turn to a lesser-known but equally powerful piece of evidence, the 12th century icon from the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. This mosaic, commissioned by local Christian communities and preserved under layers of Crusader-era renovations, also shows dark-skinned Magi and Middle Eastern prophets with features that would today be described as African. These weren't symbolic or metaphorical choices. These were accurate cultural reflections of a people who lived in the Levant, North Africa, and beyond. Consider this. Jesus was born in Bethlehem, raised in Nazareth, and spent time in Egypt. All of these are regions in or adjacent to Africa, teeming with Semitic and Cushitic peoples with dark skin. As recently as the 1st century AD, Roman and Jewish historians described the inhabitants of Judea as swarthy, with hair like wool and features similar to Ethiopians and Egyptians. It's not just about ethnicity, it's about geography, anthropology, and historical consistency. So again we ask, why is this version of history so unfamiliar to most of us? The answer lies not just in visual art, but in the written records that have been selectively highlighted or suppressed. For centuries, European scholars translated and distributed Bible editions that erased or ignored the ethnic and racial indicators found in the original texts. Consider how often phrases like, black and comely or burned like the furnace are glossed over in mainstream church teachings, despite their frequency in Scripture. Now let's take a brief detour into linguistics. The word kedar, found in the Hebrew Bible, means dark or black. Kedar was the second son of Ishmael, and his descendants were described as living in black tents and having dark skin. The tribe of Kedar is just one of many references that tie biblical figures to dark-skinned lineages. But how often do modern Bible studies dwell on that? The same pattern shows up in early rabbinic literature and Islamic hadiths, both of which describe prophets like Moses as having dark skin. Islamic texts even note that Adam was created from black clay, hence the name Adam, which some etymologists believe is related to the word Adamah, meaning earth or dark soil. These aren't fringe ideas. They're foundational concepts buried under centuries of Eurocentric interpretation. Let's zoom back into Russia. Scholars involved in the restoration process of these cellars have noted the deliberate craftsmanship of the murals. These weren't hastily painted icons. They were created with layers of meaning. One fresco shows the prophet Daniel in the lion's den, and Daniel is clearly a black man with short, textured hair and a bold gaze. But what's more striking is the Hebrew script subtly embedded into the border, a nod to Daniel's Jewish identity and the artist's awareness of the historical context. That combination, blackness and Jewishness, is something modern culture rarely acknowledges. And this leads us to an even more pressing question. If early Christians across Europe, Africa, and the Middle East knew and accepted the black identity of the Israelites and prophets, why was that identity erased so aggressively in the West? Theologian Dr. Edwin Yamuchi once said, "History is not just about what happened, but about who gets to tell the story." In the case of the Bible, the story has been retold countless times, each version shaped by the priorities of the era. During colonial expansion, biblical interpretation became a tool to justify slavery, conquest, and racial hierarchy. A black Jesus didn't fit that agenda. A black Moses freeing his people from slavery, that struck too close to home. So what did they do? They changed the images, rewrote the commentaries, removed or reinterpreted passages that emphasized liberation, ethnicity, or equality, and most importantly, they ensured that future generations, particularly in the West, would grow up with a whitewashed version of salvation history. But history has a way of resurfacing. The truth may lie buried for centuries, but it never stays silent forever. In our next segment, we'll explore the broader implications of these discoveries. How do they reshape our understanding of global Christianity? What do they mean for African and Afro-descendant communities who have long sensed a connection to the Bible's true narrative? And perhaps most importantly, what happens when the world realizes that the face of divinity might look very different than we were taught? Stay with us. The truth is just beginning to emerge. Now that we've peeled back the layers of art and text, let's talk about something even more powerful: identity. Because these revelations from Russian monasteries and ancient archives do more than just challenge dusty historical timelines. They strike at the very heart of how millions of people around the world understand themselves in relation to the divine. When you show a black child an image of a white Jesus, you're sending a subtle but powerful message that holiness, goodness, and leadership look like someone else. But when we reintroduce historically accurate images of the Israelites, dark-skinned, woolly-haired, strong, and chosen, it reclaims something stolen: the dignity of sacred representation. This is exactly what we see happening now across many parts of the African diaspora, as these Russian discoveries begin to circulate, not through mainstream media, but through independent researchers, historians, and grassroots theologians. Communities in America, the Caribbean, Africa and Europe are reconnecting with a spiritual legacy that feels both ancient and deeply personal. Take, for example, the Lemba people of Zimbabwe and South Africa. Long mocked for their claims of Jewish heritage, they've recently been vindicated through DNA evidence that shows a genetic link to the Levites, priests of ancient Israel. For centuries, they preserved oral traditions of Torah laws, kosher diets, circumcision, and even the use of Hebrew-sounding words, despite having no formal contact with European Jews. Or look at the Igbo of Nigeria, many of whom maintain customs strikingly similar to those found in the Old Testament. Festivals that mirror Passover, ancient rituals involving the Ark, and the use of the term Eri, believed by some to reference Eri, the son of Gad, one of Jacob's sons. These aren't coincidences. They're echoes. Echoes of a history scattered by exile, conquest, and slavery, yet never entirely silenced. And now, as we unearth images of a Black Christ in the Orthodox catacombs of Russia, these echoes are becoming a roar. The deeper question is, why now? Why are these cellars being opened now, after centuries of secrecy? Some speculate that it's part of a broader spiritual reckoning. Others see it as a political move. Russia asserting its unique religious heritage in a time of growing global fragmentation. But regardless of motive, the outcome is the same. The world is being forced to re-examine a narrative that has, for too long, been told by only one voice. And the implications are vast. In theology, it means reassessing how we understand biblical prophecy and fulfillment. If the Israelites were indeed black people, how do we interpret scriptures about captivity, regathering, and divine identity? What does it mean for the millions who identify as descendants of those exiled tribes? In history, it challenges the Eurocentric timeline that has long dominated textbooks. Why was the presence of African Hebrews, Nubian Christians, and dark-skinned apostles removed from the mainstream narrative? What else has been lost in the gaps? And in society, it opens doors for healing, especially among populations that have lived with the psychological residue of slavery, colonization, and cultural erasure. Imagine the power of realizing that your ancestry isn't merely linked to trauma or struggle, but to divine heritage, to prophets, kings, and chosen people. This is not about supremacy. It's about restoration. It's about balancing the historical record so that every group can see itself accurately reflected in the mirror of time. Because when we tell the truth about the past, we empower people to live more truthfully in the present. Of course, this movement is not without resistance. Many institutions have built their power on the traditional image of Christianity, white saints, European apostles, and a sanitized Jesus that fits neatly into colonial and imperial worldviews. For these groups, the idea of a black Jesus isn't just uncomfortable, it's threatening. It means rethinking everything, from religious education to cultural identity, and yet, truth doesn't go away just because it's inconvenient. These Russian artifacts have been hidden for centuries, but now they're here, staring us in the face. And every brush stroke is a challenge to reconsider what we think we know. In some cases, the Russian Orthodox Church has remained silent on these images. In others, individual monks and archivists have spoken anonymously to confirm the authenticity of the discoveries. Some researchers within Russia have been quietly compiling digital archives, hinting that a more formal release of these artworks may be imminent, though likely under tightly controlled conditions. Meanwhile, in the West, the academic world is slowly catching up. A growing number of scholars are publishing peer-reviewed work on early Christian diversity, ancient Afro-Asiatic lineages, and the racial imagery of Christ throughout history. One 2023 journal article titled Byzantine blackness, race and theology in Eastern Christian iconography made waves for tracing how certain monasteries in Russia and Greece preserved Afrocentric imagery well into the 16th century, even as the Catholic West moved in the opposite direction. But beyond academia and religious institutions, the greatest impact may be happening at the grassroots. Social media has become a battleground of historical rediscovery, with independent researchers sharing images, translations, and interpretations once confined to dusty shelves. Hashtags like Black Messiah, True Israelites, and Biblical Africa are gaining traction, not in the spirit of division, but in the pursuit of truth. And this is where you come in. Yes, you, watching this video, listening to these words, maybe questioning what you've been taught your whole life. You don't have to accept everything we've presented today at face value. In fact, we encourage you to dig deeper. Research the sources, look at the artifacts, study the scriptures in their original languages, ask uncomfortable questions. Because the truth is not afraid of investigation, the truth welcomes it. And the truth is this: black images of biblical figures are not anomalies. They are remnants, fragments of a fuller story. And now, as cellars crack open and dust falls from forgotten icons, the past is speaking once more. Will we have the courage to listen? In the final part of this episode, we'll look at how modern-day movements are reclaiming this narrative in music, art, education, and worship. We'll also explore what this means for interfaith unity, global identity, and the future of historical scholarship. But before we get there, sit with this question. If the face of Christ has been altered, what else has the world gotten wrong? As the revelations from the Russian Cellars circulate, they're not simply inspiring historians. They're galvanizing artists, musicians, educators, and faith leaders across the world to challenge the old narratives and give voice to the forgotten. What we're witnessing is not just a revival, it's a restoration. In cities like Atlanta, Lagos, Kingston, and London, churches are beginning to reimagine their visual landscapes. Stained glass depictions of white disciples are being reconsidered, replaced, or supplemented with culturally and historically accurate representations. Murals of a dark-skinned Christ now adorn the walls of Afro-Caribbean chapels, African-American cathedrals, and even some Eastern Orthodox communities who never abandoned the ancient icons to begin with. The art world is also catching fire. A wave of black iconography is emerging in modern galleries, from traditional oil paintings of black saints to Afro-futuristic interpretations of biblical epics. These aren't just aesthetic choices. They're declarations, statements that say, "We were always here." Our ancestors weren't just footnotes in scripture, they were scripture. In music too, this reawakening is booming. Gospel artists, conscious hip-hop lyricists, reggae prophets, and spoken word poets are calling out this hidden history with bold conviction. Tracks now include references to Judah, Zion, and the scattered tribes, blending cultural pride with theological depth. Albums inspired by these revelations don't just entertain, they educate. They become sonic documentaries, giving life to truths long buried beneath centuries of silence. And in the classroom, that's where one of the most crucial battles is taking place. A growing number of educators, especially in independent schools and homeschool networks, are integrating this re-examined history into their curricula. They're teaching students that the Bible wasn't born in medieval Europe, but in the deserts, cities, and villages of Afro-Asiatic peoples. That Moses likely looked more like an Ethiopian prince than a Western movie star, that the apostles could have passed as everyday men on the streets of Cairo, Nairobi, or Addis Ababa. This shift is subtle in some places, explosive in others. Some school boards resist it, others embrace it. But the momentum is growing, and every piece of authentic historical evidence, like the Russian icons, is fuel for the fire. Let's not forget the power of the internet in all this. What was once confined to secret archives is now being digitized and shared in seconds. Ancient manuscripts from Russian monasteries, once locked behind iron gates and political barriers, are now surfacing in online forums, social media channels, and documentary projects. Historians and lay people alike are using technology to build bridges across continents and centuries. One viral clip shared by a young theology student showed a side-by-side comparison. A traditional Western image of Jesus next to the 15th century Russian icon of the Black Elijah. The caption read, "One was sold to you, the other was hidden from you. Which one feels like the truth?" The comment section exploded. Thousands of people chimed in, not in anger, but in awe. Some felt betrayed, others felt empowered, but almost all felt something stir deep inside, as if centuries of distortion were finally giving way to something real. This emotional reaction isn't trivial, it matters, because identity is deeply tied to the divine. When a people are taught that holiness looks like someone else, it distorts the soul. When that false image is stripped away, there's a reckoning, but also healing. And this healing isn't just for one group, it's for everyone. You see, uncovering the black roots of biblical Israel doesn't mean excluding others. It means expanding the circle of understanding. It means acknowledging that God has always worked through diverse people, cultures, and nations. It reminds us that spiritual truth isn't limited by skin color. It's revealed through it. In this light, even the Russian Orthodox discoveries take on a larger significance. These weren't just artistic interpretations, they were preservations of truth by people who didn't yet feel the pressure to conform to Eurocentric theology. In their quiet monasteries, these monks passed down the real faces of faith, untouched by colonial revisionism. And now, centuries later, those hidden faces are resurfacing, not to divide, but to unify through truth. So where do we go from here? We continue seeking. We read the scriptures with new eyes. We support artists and educators who challenge the status quo. We dig into the archives. We ask questions that make us, and our leaders, uncomfortable. We embrace a fuller, richer, more accurate vision of sacred history, because the story of Black Biblical Israelites isn't a conspiracy theory. It's a chapter of human history that demands to be read aloud. The cellars have been opened, the dust is cleared, the icons are speaking. And now it's up to us to listen and to share what we've heard. The face of divinity, long obscured, is re-emerging, not from the heights of cathedrals, but from the depths of the earth, from the stones, the scrolls, the brushstrokes, and the bones. Not to erase anyone else's story, but to finally tell the whole one. The story of a people chosen, scattered, silenced, and now rising. This is the moment, the rediscovery, the restoration, and it's only just begun.